You want to raise your hand if you were not? What?
I saw one hand.
Yeah, Phil. Okay, Scott, Phil and Scott. Okay. For your guys, and Jess, you were not here last time? And Louis, okay. For your guys' benefit, last time we spent the entire time going through an observation that there's a category of knowledge of I suppose you'd call it knowledge graph data, knowledge graph information, knowledge graph knowledge that we've sort of ignored. And there's a whole other industry that calls itself knowledge management, knowledge bases, knowledge portals, knowledge this, knowledge that, which we as knowledge graph aficionados have kind of ignored, because most, I think when we looked last time, there was 3 different places you could become accredited as a knowledge manager. I doubt if there's any place you can get accredited as being a knowledge graph person or a semantic in any of that. Maybe there's accreditation I never come across, but A, I was amazed to find this. B, that most of the pieces of software I'd either never heard of or never occurred to me that it was knowledge management, Confluence being one of the main ones. We have Confluence. I find it as kind of a interesting partial solution to content it solves 1% of my content management problem, which is sort of interesting. It could be knowledge management, but at least are you like that? So anyhow, we went through a lot of that and then finally landed on the idea that there's probably a parallel relationship between knowledge and knowledge graphs as there is between taxonomies and ontologies. And we pretty much come to this idea that the way taxonomies and ontologies exist well together, at least the way we promote it, is this idea we have literally a single property called is categorized by, and classes are just collections of taxonomic distinctions. It seems to work in almost every place we've seen, simplifies the design, it's a repeatable pattern, and it sort of prevents taxonomists from getting carried away and trying to make one giant tree, a la SNOMED, a la RX norm, all of some of those gigantic, not very useful classonomies. Anyway, we proceeded from that to this parallel universe where we find there's knowledge out there that is, near as I can tell, captured mostly in content and documents, not.
Dave,
yeah.
Do you think you're sharing your screen?
No, I know. I was recapping last week.
Okay.
Because what I was going to do.
Jumped to that earlier, and I thought maybe.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I realized there's a handful of people that weren't here last week, so I thought I would just give a very brief recap of how we came to the conclusion, and then we're going to jump into the conclusion, look at all the examples you guys brought forward, which is to say one, and then figure out what we're going to do with this. So the tentative conclusion is that this thing that purports to be knowledge and knowledge management and knowledge base is one of 4 things, 3 of which we have well handled. It's either facts, which we put in an A box, like how tall is the Empire State Building. It's either type or set information that the Empire State Building is a skyscraper and a building and a landmark and a tourist attraction, all that kind of stuff. Or the tourist attraction was, or it's categorical information. and we put that in a knowledge graph in the C box. It's taxonomic distinctions on instances. But then this last category, there is a small amounts of information. We went through 4 or 5 examples of information that isn't easily attached either to individual instances in the real world nor to classes. It's in this kind of odd world that, and we suggested, and this is where I'm going to share my screen, where we got to. Now I've lost my screen, but it's, where is it? There it is. The tentative suggestion here was that we could have one new class called concept, which might, we left hanging last week. We might repurpose ghost concept, but we might be squatting on what they meant, because I don't think anybody quite knows exactly what they meant with that. And maybe it's okay to squat on that. But somewhere there's an idea that most of this stuff that seems to be knowledge that doesn't fit one of the other 3 categories is about a concept. Sometimes, and here's a few examples, choline as a chemical is, if you actually have some choline, if you have 100 pounds of choline, that's physical substance. We can weigh it, drop it on your toe, and then inspect, figure out how pure it is, all that kind of stuff. If we're trying to buy choline, we have a product spec, we know what that is. That's an instance of product specification, etc. But sometimes we just want to talk about choline in general. What do we know about choline, and what does it work with, and how does it do its thing? So, that's an idea of a concept, and it's more than a category, because these concepts are going to have more richer relationships attached to them. That's what the next slide is going to be. But there's also, most businesses have something. We did some work with a wealth management thing, and a 529 retirement account is a concept. It has, restrictions on where you can put the money and whether it's taxed and all that kind of stuff. So more than a category. That one's probably close to a specification, but let's put it down here as knowledge for a moment. Places, conditions, all that kind of stuff. And there are some relationships. This is what I think distinguishes it from categories. There's some interesting relationships between these concepts or between the concepts and real things. So for instance, we talked about Brent crude as a concept. At some point, it is eventually a specification or a very specific commodity, but there's just a general idea of Brent crude oil, and these traders say, oh yeah, you usually get that in the North Sea. Well, the North Sea actually is a geospatial instance. We know where the North Sea is roughly, but you can also relate concepts to concepts. You could say crude oil is found in reservoirs, being just another concept. So we probably only need one class. It's either a new class or it's SCOS concept. And we put forward the idea, this is what we can discuss now. I want to put everything in the gist namespace, but these things are kind of weird, and it seemed useful to create another namespace. And the reason I went with typically and this TYP is because many of the early examples, like the trader at S&P who said, Brent crude oil is typically found in the North Sea, and Brent crude oil typically has low levels of sulfur, and typically this. He was using the word typically so much, and I noticed that shows up a lot in these things. So I just suggested a handful of predicates here. We're going to see a couple more in a minute. And there's still a debate as to whether these predicates should be object type predicates or annotations, as I suggested here. that's kind of up for grabs. And I think I'm going to stop sharing this and switch over to Jonathan, because he did his homework. Just share this other screen. Maybe. There we go. So he decided to do his for a database of nature sounds, essentially. Jonathan, feel free to jump in and interpret anything I say. But here, this would be a concept. In fact, yeah, I suppose we should have said experiencing nature sounds. First thing is RDF type concept. But once we've got that, we say it typically causes, one to relax, one with ADHD, blah, blah, blah. So causes was one of the ones we suggested might, and another reason for distinguishing these is in these knowledge bases, people are way fuzzier. In fact, this is what came up in the discussion last time about fuzzy logic or percentages and stuff. They're way fuzzier about ideas like causes. It's not true, Judea Pearl style, we can prove that A causes B. This is some very fluffy, weak ideas, but they're useful anyway. So causes was one of the relationships. Involves, so this is sound involves some other things that are, they could be text, or, you might involve another concept. Sorry. Okay, and then, and the sound is used in, I don't know if that was one of my, no, I didn't have that. Oh yeah, well, I did. So he used 3 of the ones I already had there. The ideal workstation, involved in all these things. It probably involves in experiencing nature sound. I forgot if we did that. And best practices, blah, blah, blah. So there is the only extant example we have.
Yeah, these were all things that I didn't want to put in a formal knowledge graph the other way, but they're important for me to note somewhere. And of course I can put them in notes, but this has me really excited about how to get them into the single place where I want to put all my data.
Yeah, no, right on. Thanks for doing that. And I think you're hitting on what I just find absurd is there's this whole parallel universe over there building knowledge bases and portals and all this stuff that is disconnected. I mean, kind of crazy, but Rebecca, you're muted.
I think there's a subtle distinction here between what you're calling a concept and a SCOS concept, and therefore I would not suggest using SCOS concept, because a concept is truly in SCOS a unit of thought. This is how they define it. And therefore, for example, in Jonathan's example, if we were to use SCOS concept, it would mean thinking about experiencing bird sounds or whatever it is would cause you to relax. It's not the thinking of it, it's the actual experiencing bird sounds.
Yeah, I agreed.
Yeah. In my initial thing, I was hesitant to squat on SCOS concept, and that's probably a good reason. So Michael.
Yeah.
Oh, do you have more?
5 more, but I'll put my hand up again.
Okay.
All right. So I was thinking something related to SCOS concept. So I think Dave meant to have SCOS concept be a new thing that excludes the other 3 facts, instances, and categories. But SCOS concept is intended to include all those things. So that's another reason why not to use SCOS concept, because it's more inclusive than you want. In response to Rebecca's comment, I think that I wouldn't interpret it too pernickety. I mean, too specifically to say it has to mean thinking. Unithought just means something that you can think about. I don't think it requires thinking as a verb. But that's maybe a small point.
Okay, let's go to John Cowan.
Oh, your mic's not working, John.
Yeah. Still not hearing you, John.
Back around if you can get it going.
Should we come back to you, John? You go experiment with. I usually leave teams altogether and come back. You know, not just close this one. I have to shut down the whole program and start over again. But that's just me. Rebecca and then Boris. Stab in the past.
Just to respond to Michael's response to me, I think there's a reason why SCOS defines only properties like broader, narrower, you know, exact match, close match. It's because it's about how those concepts relate to one another. It's not about how, you know, the actual thing represented by that concept relates to something similar. I wondered, you know, the second point, your use of the namespace typically, this is more of a question, is using a particular namespace enough to say that something is typically causes or typically has high levels of or whatever, or does that actually have to be in the property? Because we don't typically think of namespaces as conferring meaning in that way. And also, what if you had some knowledge that said usually does not, or, well, I guess you could turn that around, or yeah. But at any rate, the real question is, can a namespace be used in that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think you would literally in each property say, you repeat yourself and say this is meant to be typically,
Yeah,
and the namespace is just meant for a cute little hint.
Okay, that's what I thought you'd have to do. Yeah.
Boris.
Hey, can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So, you know, coming at it from the sort of the engineering point of view, as I see the example of, you know, a wall of free-form text attached to something, it makes it difficult to interact with it from a software perspective, right? In the same sort of way that a Word document is more useful than a yellow legal pad, right? Because it's searchable and if you have, I mean, the properties described there as it is would have to be annotation properties because there's absolutely no restriction as to what the content actually is. And I guess I question the utility other than annotation of just attaching volumes of free-form text with a vague hint as to from the property itself as to what it's used for. To me, and again, this is kind of a deeply personal preference, is that a knowledge graph helps you structure the free-form knowledge as opposed to just having a place to put things. I mean, there's a reason why we put things in slots as opposed to just making piles around the house. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Cool. Philippe.
Yeah, I had one observation to share. It's a small one, but I think that these concepts come in 2 forms. There might be some of these concepts that have more of distributions. So we're thinking of something, and that might be measurable, but as a distribution. Like we have a risk, we have the probability of something being in a certain range, and we could make a distribution out of that one. And some of these concepts are non-measurable, like Boris mentions, where it's just a pile of text to describe a specific or a non-specific concept in around this area, something like this, without really having the touchy-feely of it. So just wanted to share that observation that you might subdivide this one into 2 kinds of concepts that people might put in here. And
Very
it
good.
also aligns with
Yep.
Boris' idea of a mathematical expression for some of it, because some of this might be distributions that would help a mathematical concept at least.
Cool. Thank
And
you.
specifically for risk was the idea that I had.
Yeah. Michael.
Yeah, on this notion of TYP as a namespace as opposed to just, so I interpret that to mean, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there might be a just causes, which means what we ordinarily think of causes, but then there's going to be another causes, which is TYP causes, right? That's what you're thinking?
Yep.
Okay, so
exactly.
you could have a separate namespace, but that would be equivalent to simply having two properties in the just namespace, actually causes and
Yeah.
typically causes.
Typically
It's
causes,
exactly,
yeah.
it's exactly the same thing, and I don't know what
Yeah.
benefit you get by having it in the namespace, but it's just wondering about that.
That's what I was suggesting, because
Interesting. Okay.
using the
Yeah.
namespace isn't enough
Yep.
to indicate.
Yep. I think Jamie's up next.
Okay, I think some of these things might go into the realm of alternative logic systems. If you talk about what Boris was saying, I mean, just a bunch of text doesn't really give you much, and yeah, you could probably do that with OWL. But if you actually want to do any sort of logic based on this information, it probably does not fall within OWL's logical framework, and it's probably outside of OWL completely, in the fact that it's not an OWL property. It's, you know, some new sort of logic framework.
Yeah, you know, I suspect that all these so-called knowledge bases and knowledge management systems have no logic systems at all. Not a different one. I suspect they don't have any at all. But I'm not a knowledge management certified professional, but I just play one on TV. Hey, John, did you get your audio back?
I hope so. I'm on the phone now. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So that's me, 1212, blah, blah, blah. Boy, a lot of things have gone down since then. The first thing that comes to mind is the question of whether concept is a hyponym of category. I mean, you talked about categories, you know, don't have specific properties, whereas concepts do, and that made me think that, well, maybe this is maybe this means that that concept is a subclass of category. What do you think about that idea?
It's certainly possible. Yep.
Okay, and then as far as reasoning goes, I think that, you know, there's formal reasoning and there's informal reasoning. We handle formal reasoning very well. Informal reasoning, I would say, by definition, cannot be plugged into a reasoner, because reasoners are too stupid to understand it, or too formal, whichever you like. And that therefore the intention of this thing is to capture stuff that is not either not yet formalized, or that we suspect will never be formalized because we don't really know what's going on with it. But nevertheless, we want to have it around in a way that's a little bit stronger and a little bit stronger than just a free-form note.
Yeah, and
I think if we push it toward, the more we push it toward formality, the less useful it becomes, because we already know how to do formal stuff.
Yeah, exactly. If we can get the instances to either be individual things in the real world, or categories, or classes, we already know how to deal with those. This is the fourth category that we're squishing around with. Okay, Philippe, you're back.
Yeah, exactly. So it was in relation to knowledge management and the work that I've done in that realm for some large enterprises in the past. And I would agree to the previous sentences here in relation to the informal reasoning. It's really about helping humans to reason about stuff. And that means it's very imprecise. It has categories, it has taxonomies and other things in relation to the content, but it's usually by customer services teams and other teams that really relate to text, not the data in it. And it wouldn't be used as data, but rather maybe have some classification or neural networks working on it, but it wouldn't be that kind of a knowledge that we are thinking of here as formalized, reasonable, or knowledge you can reason
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Right. Reasonable.
Yeah.
Hey, I would love to drill in a little bit more on your experience, because I don't have any experience at all. Do you mind talking a little bit about like what was the
Yeah.
projects and what tools and how much knowledge constitutes knowledge and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I'll try to keep it short. But what I did was I've been helping both Sony and IKEA using the Oracle Inquira system. So originally it was Inquira as a standalone company bought up by Oracle. So I worked with them in two instances on handling customer services knowledge in general. And the idea there is to enable the agent to use something called knowledge-centered support, which is the KCS. It's a methodology to reuse knowledge in your enterprise so that you work with the most enterprise, the best knowledge, and you increase its value over time, but you only work on the important parts. So every time you search for knowledge, you find some knowledge, you iterate upon it. When you're sending a customer service reply, you work with the better reply. And each time you improve the knowledge in the system so you can find it, you can search for it, and you support the organization. So I was the capability owner for knowledge management for their customer service project at the time. So this is a few years ago. So those are some of those experiences in terms of how to use knowledge and categorize it, put it in a taxonomy, make sure it's useful. And it's really about enabling people to do better work through knowledge and manage that knowledge in a coherent, good way so that you have one content team. If you're doing it really well, you have one content team that curate the content and one team that uses this, but you make sure that there is a back and forth between the teams, and preferably also with your quality teams in the background, because you can use all of those metrics you have in your knowledge base for improving all of the things that you're doing with the customers over time. You can do self-service, you can do all of these kinds of extra things. And it's super useful, but it's not as precise.
Yeah.
And it's not the purpose to be precise.
That is
useful.
That's a perfect example. And I'm assuming, did you miss the last session?
No, I was here as well. So
yeah. So you may,
it was a beautiful one.
Yeah, but you might remember one of the examples was customer service. I don't know if you remember the PayPal thing that's great. And interestingly, Oracle's Inquire didn't show up on either of my lists of knowledge management systems.
No, it's not called Inquira anymore. So originally, this company was built on Oracle databases in the early 2000s, and they were acquired by Oracle in 2008, 2010 timeframe, and rebranded into their advanced knowledge management database, something like that. So it kind of became just an Oracle.
Yeah.
Or not just, but yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right. And actually, you're right at the point of the spear here that I want to talk about, because it's one thing to organize that knowledge so the customer support people can get at it. But what if you could also integrate it with everything else we know about for instance, we could know in the knowledge graph that this customer who's calling had a refund issued 2 days ago. That'd be in the graph, but we don't know what to do about it, because what to do about it's over in the knowledge base. If you could just snap that together, you're done.
And there's an important connection to make, which wasn't made at the time by anyone I knew or any literature I've found. A lot of things might have happened. This is almost 10 years ago that I had this experience. But I would say that this would have been very useful. And I would think that in terms of digital transformation initiatives, should connect the two so that you have your product information management systems, your supply chain management systems, all of these different systems are working with entities that are relevant to see as in your enterprise as a graph, so that you can make that useful, make those connections. But to some extent, you need to make all of these connections, and they would be largely manual. We didn't have AI to the level we have today for automatic classification. I believe that using machine learning tools today would help you to make a lot of those classifications, at least help you ingest the content and connect the content in a relevant enough way so that customer service agents would find with some relevance what they need to find and make sure that they can improve that knowledge over time. That this was an accurate representation, this wasn't. And then you can teach your machine learning operations in a good way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great.
That would be my inferences. Yeah.
Yeah. No, those are great. Do you recall roughly the amount of knowledge that was in this knowledge base and either of those, Sony or IKEA?
I would not be at the liberty to say anything about that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. No, that's fair enough. Because I'm just trying to get my head around, how hard would it be to actually stitch these things together? Because I'm suspecting, at least for our limited experience with a couple of these things, that a lot of the hard work is over on the knowledge graph side, knowing that this customer has this device and this device has these problems and all that is structured, but then knowing that there's one last connection that, oh, you should do this.
Yeah, but that is that is not the logical reasoning we're talking about. That is the informal reasoning. That is the tacit understanding of the field of play of how things are. This is what some of the teams in these enterprises are experts at. That gut feeling of exactly how do they think about these things. They would be able to take the typical cases and put them down, and these are the things to look at when you see these kinds of problems. And that is exactly this kind of knowledge, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent.
Because you would have a few phones that, okay, when you see this class of errors and the way that a customer describes them, they would describe it in this way. It's typically, and to use that word, it's a really great one. Typically, it involves these kind of processes having going wrong, and typically we would do these things with it. Yeah. We don't know exactly, but usually it works. So it's all of those high value things for an enterprise, but it's not precise enough to compute on.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Excellent.
I think so.
Yeah. I think that the two areas, and maybe they're sort of related if you really, that are the most fertile ground. One is customer support, and the other is healthcare, life science. They have so much knowledge that is semi-precise.
Yeah, but it comes with biological processes. I mean, customer service is the same. It's a biological process to help people to overcome a pain. And really, it's not a problem, it's a pain.
Yeah.
And it's not an exact solution. It's a pain that needs to be resolved, and it can be resolved in a multitude of ways. As long as people are happy in the end, it works.
Yeah, that's good. That is good.
And we're dealing with mathematical and logical foundations here in the knowledge graphs that we expect to be very precise. Practical, but precise.
Right. That's good. Did anyone else want to riff on the other thing I was saying in the last session, which is I'm still of two minds as to whether in many of these domains you end up with two repositories, if you will. One is where you have all the messy evidence and extra structure, and people argue about how do we know what we know, and another one that just says, oh yeah, this is good enough, let's just run with this. And here's my kind of examples. In healthcare, there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of articles and studies and clinical trials and stuff about the efficacy of X on certain conditions. And people are constantly adding into that pile. But periodically, some healthcare company just says, all of our physicians have to prescribe one of these drugs if ICD-10 code is one of these. So now it's all of a sudden over here on one side, you don't want all that messy evidence and all that kind of crap. Just tell me what we currently think is true, and we're just going to run with that. Do you guys think that's a general pattern, or do you think you should just load it all up together, or what? See,
Absolutely
Peter's got
general.
So I got Steve Chalm and then Peter.
Yeah, so it seems like this typical predicate could apply to things that aren't what we've been calling concepts. Like you could say, I mean, you could have things that are very well defined, and you want to say that, pigeons are typically pests. And pigeon and pest are well defined. It's the predicate that's a little fuzzy. So, so what we've been calling object here is it really just thing that we want to be able to talk about anything using these vaguer predicates.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe we don't need concept. Maybe thing is fine. Peter.
So I think that here we're talking about stuff that's the realm of inductive logic and data mining and things like that, where it's kind of fuzzy. And there is quite a bit of literature in that area. And people do indeed, if you're not specific about things, like in the DCAP world, we would say, here's a resource. We've got an identifier for it, but we don't really know much about it. And we'll do something with it in due course as the understanding of it becomes clearer. And it's probably worth our while sort of digging into the inductive logic programming and how that fits in with description logics in order to kind of take this forward, because I'm sure there are some good ideas that have been worked through there.
Is there a formalism of inductive logic?
There've been attempts at doing things like that, and I would need to go back and dig into these sort of things. But it was something that was very popular about, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 years ago.
Okay. So John, you're back on?
Yeah. So yes, this is a very familiar pattern from legal history where you get codes of law, which usually are the first things we know about, and then they develop these growths that are interpretations. You can't sue for the destruction of your vines because the law says you can sue for destruction of trees. Vines are obviously not trees, and then another court comes along and says, well, for this purpose, vines are trees, and so you get these jokes about, for railway purposes, a tortoise is a kind of insect, or maybe vice versa, and so these things grow, and then a wave of codification comes through and wipes them away, and that this just happens over and over again in legal history.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, legal is another domain, and we worked in that domain and didn't trip to this. Yeah, that is a good one.
Okay, so the other thing I would say about inductive logic is that I want to point to NARS, the non-axiomatic reasoning systems, which you can Google for them, which involve the idea of a formal explication of what it means for something to be not partly true, which would be fuzzy logic, but how strong the evidence is for it.
Wow.
So this allows you to deal with things like, in Aristotelian or for that matter, Frege logic, you have it doesn't matter how many swans you see that are white. It doesn't improve the odds it doesn't improve your ability to conclude that swans are white. But if you're allowed to treat that as evidence, then you can every new swan raises the likelihood somewhat, and every new white swan, raises the likelihood that all swans are white. And the guy who did this, Peter, I want to say Wang, but I'm not sure that's his name. Anyway, NARS. Has a whole reasoning system to support this stuff, not only deductive logic and inductive logic, but also abductive logic.
Wow.
which is important to me because of my philosophical roots. Abduction is the idea that, you know, the sidewalks are wet, you know, therefore it has rained. You know, this is not sound reasoning, but it's pretty good. And
Yeah.
you know, the formality of abduction, the formal expression of abduction is, if the conclusion were true, the evidence would be present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to just wave those two
Yeah.
flags in front of you.
Yeah, that was great. Excellent. Philippe, you're back on again.
Yeah, so I want to point back to something that Peter said that was important for two reasons, but we'll do something with this in the future. I think that was a beautiful thing to put with it, because you will probably improve this knowledge over time. Coming back to the previous argument, that you will improve this knowledge over time. That means we don't know what it is, and if we don't know what it is, should we put it in the knowledge graph? Because putting it in the knowledge graph implies that we have a class for it, and that class should not move in the future. If we find out that we should put this somewhere else, should we have put it in the knowledge graph in the first place as something? So that is a question that I would pose for this kind of knowledge, based on the reasoning that we've done so far. So I feel that there is something there that we need to figure out in terms of the position for it, because it might move to a different class in the future. And if it does, then it wouldn't be a subclass of where it is at the moment. So that was what I wanted to add.
Yeah. How do you feel, given what Steve Challam said about just saying it's our thing? It's still going to be our thing, no matter what class we put it in.
That is truism. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
In one way, that's very true, but you would end up with having very imprecise thing, and everyone would shove everything into thing. Does it make sense to have it there? I mean, yeah,
I know. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Mike Sullivan.
On a more pedantic level, all these tools like Pool Party and stuff, they're creating all these taxonomies that are based on SCAs, and of course, there's no auto magic way of merging them with ontologies. A lot of that's manual, and basically, people have kind of said, well, that's the job for companies like yours, right? So my question is, or statement, or however you want to look at it, how would what you're proposing help that merging of these existing SCAs taxonomies with ontologies?
Yeah, I think, well, this is just my opinion, everybody else can chime in. I think most of what's in Calibra we would call taxonomies, not knowledge. And therefore,
did you mean to say Calibra? Because he said Pool Party or something like that.
Oh, sorry, but Pool Party is same.
It's
I think same. It is, yeah, you're right. You did say Pool Party. But that's just my opinion. Has anybody seen evidence of knowledge in Pool Party or Calibra or Semaphore or any of those?
There's certainly marketing in them as knowledge. Yeah. I mean, I know the guys at Pool Party pretty well. Another point I just want to make up is SCAs does have some fuzziness, not as much as you're expecting or proposing, but it's basically already a step in the direction that you guys are talking about.
Yeah. Peter, back up.
Just following on from Philippe and your question about Stephen's suggestion. So within a DCAT situation, because DCAT dataset is a subclass of DCAT resource, it's very different from assigning it to think. What you've really done is you've done a couple of things. The first thing is that you've got an identifier for the instance, which is persistent. And then the other thing is that you've kind of brought it in as an instance of a class, which means that it's something of interest. And it's, if you decide then that you're going to make it a data set, it's very easy just to sort of slip it to a more specific class within the same framework.
Yep, right on. Jonathan?
I've worked a lot with Calibra, and the loose sense of a concept, or in the loose sense, you could say it is a knowledge management system, but I don't see it as that. And it doesn't have any capacity for doing the kinds of informal knowledge that I can think of.
Right. Okay. Michael Ushel.
Yeah, just to follow up, I've also worked with Cleveland. I would agree with what Jonathan said, but that's not why I raised my hand. Just going back to the different forms of reasoning, for decades, ever since back in the 80s and probably 70s, there's been lots of different forms of reasoning from, default logic, regular, traditional classical logic, first order logic, the subsets like OWL. Then this new thing called NARS, rule-based expert systems, reasoning with uncertainty, default logics. There's all kinds of stuff out there. What's interesting, what's important for us is to figure out who's done something or what can we do that integrates it in with the traditional knowledge graph, which is Owlbased reasoning. And I'm sure there's been some work along those lines, but I'm not aware of any in particular.
Yep. John Cowan, back up.
Yeah, I just didn't hang. I just didn't drop the flag.
Okay. So, what should we do about all this? And actually, I think the one example, Jonathan, you get an A for actually doing the homework, and it's one of many styles. Although this one was mostly concept, typically, and then narrative, which is probably closer to what a traditional knowledge base would have. I think there's a lot of examples we could have had if you guys had done your homework, where you have concept, typically concept, or instance, typically concept, or concept, typically instance. I think there's a lot more permutations here than we've explored. Philippe.
There's a little bit of discussion of that in the chat.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay.
So, I wrote in the chat as we're ending around the hour. I was thinking there is a distinction here that I've observed as well in terms of being subjective versus objective. What we have in the knowledge graph is normally objective. We can say it's one thing with precision. But what these things are, at least from the examples, they're subjective in most cases.
Yeah.
There is a subject that expresses an opinion about something that is typically or approximately or their idea, and something that could be argued as being one or the other by two different people. And so whose perspective should it be for the things that are put in the graph, if so? Something I wanted to add.
Yeah.
Notice.
No, that's a great one. Yep. Thank you. John.
Yeah. Just in response to that, I don't think that there's anything about owl-based reasoning that says it's subjective. That there's, it's perfectly reasonable to create, the Tosca knowledge graph that tells you all about the opera. It tells you all about the opera. Is going to be full of subjective judgments. To classify something as a great opera as a subjective judgment, but it's a perfectly owlish sort of notion. So I don't think that's really. I think people tend to use it for objective knowledge, but I don't think there's anything inherently objective about it. But the other thing is the business with thing. The more I think about that, the less I think that thing is suitable, just because you will get an overly large amount of inference out of it. It's true. It's important to keep the informal stuff somewhat segregated, just so that you don't get, so that everything doesn't turn into a concept.
Yep. No, I think you're right. Phil.
On your list of properties, I don't think I saw the implies, which might be a useful one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you might have a combination of conditions where, like, an instance of a graph pattern would imply that you should take certain action. So, and regardless of the form of reasoning, could be adductive or inductive. What you're saying is that A implies B.
Yeah, yeah, and for most cases, we won't even know if it's inductive or abductive. It would just be some human from their experience said, yeah, this implies that. The wet, in fact, the wet pavement implies the rain, right?
By abduction, yes.
Yeah, yep. Steve.
Charles Sanders Peirce loved to have things in threes, so he would instinctively reject anything that had only induction and deduction.
Yeah.
So in response to John, I just wanted to say, I mean, we need some kind of connections between the concepts and the objective entities if we're going to make use of it in the ways we've been talking about. So I don't know. I mean, I get the point about reasoning, but we have to make some connections there. And then to what Philippe said, I don't think we want to make anything things. I don't think we want to instantiate thing for this. And if there is some general idea like concept that we want to, use for things like for subjective things like beauty or Brent, or vague things like Brent Crude, we can have a category for those. It's more that we want these relationships to be able to apply to anything, that we want to be able to build connections. And I'm thinking maybe these need to be reified so that, we can have a says who attribute to answer that question. And we can have more than one says who. And then also gives us a place to put degrees of belief or, how we want to measure, whatever kind of percentages we want to attach to it.
Yeah, I think you're describing more precisely what I was describing vaguely as saying maybe there's two repos, one that has the reification and the who says and the evidence. And my other example of that distinction was genealogy, which is dead simple. If you just say, I just want to know who begat whom and who's male or female or whatever, but all those genealogy systems are incredibly complex because most of the classes and stuff are all about the evidence of was this person this child and all, not about, once you boil it down and just say, yeah, that was their child, then you got a simple structure. But Dylan.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about, which I wanted to add, was I agree that inductive logics and like non-monotonic logics could be useful for this kind of thing. But it's also worth mentioning that there's probably a lot of deductive reasoning that we could do over this kind of knowledge, which would be plausible and still useful. Like going back to the example of Brent Crude being found in the particular ocean that it's in, maybe I think it's the Atlantic. You also know that it's typically found in an ocean. Not that interesting, but it is something that, given the right rule set, right, plausible rule set, you could do some deductive reasoning over it as well.
Interesting. So you're making a pretty good argument about one of the conclusions I was about. I was going to try and wrap this up in the last couple of minutes and see if we've made any progress. But here's 2 or 3 things I think I heard that maybe I'll go forward with. One is maybe we don't need another namespace for the hint that these are typicallys, that if instead we just put in the gist namespace and said gist : typically clauses, gist : typically contains, gist : typically found in. If you guys want to vote on that, we can do that in a second. But the other one, I was just about to have an idea, and you may have undermined it there, Dylan, which is okay. I won't hold it against you. But I was thinking one argument for having these things be annotations instead of object properties is sort of where Jonathan went, where when I was thinking these two things were going to connect 2 instances, the exact same predicate connected an instance to its string, which obviously you can do with an annotation, you can't do with an object property.
It would be nice to go either way, but at this point, my initial is I'm just using it as my knowledge graph notepad, but eventually I'd want to migrate some things out of that.
Yeah. Michael and Rebecca. Rebecca is going to get the last word, it looks like it, unless Michael filibusters. Michael, you're
mic isn't working.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So whether you have a different namespace or not is not my question. But if you have two, meaning one meaning typically, the other one meaning actually, do we have a way to relate the fact that they're related to each other? To relate the two, we haven't even talked about that. There is a core underlying relationship. So I just thought I'd mention that in passing.
Yeah. Especially if it contains in some of these. Yeah. Rebecca.
Regarding the namespace, I do think I mentioned in the chat that it's useful to draw a kind of hard line between what GIST is the kind of ontology GIST is, with formal semantics and logical entailment, and I don't know, whatever you want to call this other thing, which doesn't involve logical entailments in the same way. The other point, I kind of like Stephen's suggestion of a reification where you can indicate probability. I mean, typical, it's not a binary thing. It's 30% likely or 80% likely, you might call typical. What is typical? And then the other point, the other question, what is the relationship between these statements and actual RDF, such as, for example, the concept of a chair is that it typically has 4 legs, and the statement, this chair has 4 legs, has these legs 4 times. So there should be some relationship there.
Yeah, I think that's what Michael was just suggesting. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's good to reinforce some of these ideas. Yeah, I think like typically contains and does contain. Yeah, there's some kind of relationship there.
You could use RDF star to do that, to reify the contains relationship and just tag it with typically using RDF star.
Yeah, well, I still don't think it's a binary typical or actual. I think it's a probability.
I mean, what Michael's saying is you can put a number on the RDF star. You can put a number on the edge, but I don't think. I think you're gonna mess with OWL pretty badly if you do that.
Yeah, that's quite possible.
Yeah. OWL full would do it, but not regular OWL.
Yeah. Yeah, or OWL star. Nobody's even talking about OWL star.
God forbid.
Okay, well,
I think this was a subclass. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to wrap because we're at the top of the hour.
That's fine.
I think it was quite a useful, and it's great to have so much interaction. There's a lot of energy on this topic. I don't exactly know where to go next with this. I think, next GIST forum, let's just get back on track and do something more normal. But maybe I'll try and take all the suggestions. I did copy the chat, and when I get a chance, I'll go read it. Maybe, given what Rebecca just said there toward the end, maybe the namespace should be just KM or something, and a different hint. I don't know. We'll think about that offline.
I like that.
I was thinking just fuzzy.
Or just
okay.
It's not fuzzy.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. It was good as ever. Take care.
Thank you.